This is MichMash, a weekly conversation where we try to unjumble an important and sometimes under the radar statewide story that affects you. I'm Cheyna Roth.
And I'm Alethia Kasben. Cheyna, we have been focused on the budget for the last few weeks, but while that's been going on, another big upcoming event has been chugging along as well.
That's right. Let's not forget that we have an election coming up next year. And with just over a year until Election Day, some fundraising numbers are out. So let's dig into those and see what they can tell us about the current state of the race.
So one of the lingering questions in the congressional races is whether U.S. Rep. Bill Huizenga on the west side of the state is going to seek re-election. Despite not being clear on his intentions just yet, Huizenga raised a little over $325,000 during the third quarter of the year, according to campaign finance reports filed this week.
So Huizenga's potential competition and presumed frontrunner for the Democratic nomination, State Senator Sean McCann, is hot on his heels, raising just over $300,000 this quarter. So, Alethia, this is a big deal race. It's a congressional seat that leans Republican, and you'd think Huizenga would be, if not a shoo-in as an incumbent, have a really good shot at winning. So why is he still debating entering the race?
Earlier this year, Huizenga was very clear he wanted to run for U.S. Senate, and his fundraising numbers during that time were better than what he reported this week. So he does have $1.4 million in the bank compared to $200,000 for McCann, just to note that. However, President Donald Trump asked him not to run for U.S. Senate and has now endorsed former U.S. Rep. Mike Rogers, who ran and lost in 2024. So Huizenga has a decision to make now. He was ready to not seek re-election in his U.S. House seat and run for U.S. Senate. Now he can not run for the House but do something else or seek re-election. So far, he has said he hasn't made a decision, but it is worth noting that President Trump is very focused on the U.S. House races in 2026, and certainly his camp wants Huizenga to stay put to give them the best chance of keeping the seat. If it's open in 2026, Democrats will have a much better shot.
What about the 13th district? That's another one that we've been paying special attention to. Current incumbent Cherie Tanidar is being primaried by Representative Donovan McKinney, and Tanidar has the massive bulk of his $3.9 million that he's raised over the whole cycle coming from mining cryptocurrency. What does that mean?
So please don't ask me to explain cryptocurrency. Listeners, you can Google that. But what it means in the practical sense is that Tanidar, partly because of his investment strategy, but mostly because of his own wealth that he already put into his campaign in 2024, has $8 million in the bank.
That is so much money. Like, even by just general candidacy standards, that is a haul. And while Tanidar is using crypto investments, McKinney, he really doesn't stand a chance from a fundraising perspective up against that amount of money. Do you think he stands any chance of winning against this kind of money coming from an incumbent?
So McKinney raised, I think, a couple $100,000, which is, a solid haul. But yeah, compared to $8 million, you can't beat that money-wise, right? But the one thing Democrats seem to have this cycle, and they have been trying to beat Tanidar for a couple of cycles now, is a mostly one-on-one race with a strong candidate. In 2024, the frontrunner to take on Tanidar didn't even make the ballot, so there was really no real shot to get him out of Congress. In 2022, it was an open seat, and it was a crowded primary, and Tanidar was able to pull through. McKinney has some solid backing. I think, if he's hitting the doors, if he's doing the groundwork, he could pull it off.
Let's shift gears here and talk about the U.S. Senate race. We got numbers from 4 candidates, 3 Democrats and 1 Republican. The Democrats are close in funds raised. U.S. Rep. Haley Stevens is in the lead, raising $1.9 million and sitting with $2.6 million in the bank. Abdul El Sayed raised $1.8 million and has $1.8 million on hand. Mallory McMorrow raised $1.7 million and has $1.5 million on hand. And Republican Mike Rogers is sitting with $2.7 million in the bank after raising about $2 million. Alethia, there's a lot of numbers on there, a lot of millions. What do you make of this?
A lot of millions, some big numbers here that I think, show a couple of things. One, the Democratic primary is truly a competitive race. Haley Stevens has what we'd call sort of the establishment backing. So I think it makes sense that she is in the lead, but it's not a terribly commanding lead money wise, right? That's not make it or break it kind of money for her. And Mike Rogers with a cleared field and a Trump endorsement, he's just going to be able to keep bringing in the money, building up his war chest, and waiting for this general election race to start next year.
For the Democrats, Stevens is in the lead, but El-Sayed isn't too far behind, and he's ahead of McMorrow. El-Sayed is not currently a politician, and yet he's in the running against a current U.S. representative and a state senator. Is his not doing the day-to-day politician work helping him out here? Is that possible outsider candidate label helping him? I know he's not overall above Stevens, but still, I feel like he's doing better than I would have expected. And how do you think he's pulling this off?
So El-Sayed is not an elected official, but he still has clout from his run in the 2018 gubernatorial primary. He has the endorsement from U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders, and he was the top health official in Wayne County before launching this campaign. So he is well known, and he is well liked in Michigan's progressive circles, which is, his main source of support. And he's also hitting the state really hard. He's campaigning really hard, and certainly, not having to go to either Lansing or Washington, D.C. to cast votes and sit all night in the Capitol in Lansing like Mallory McMorrow had to do the other day. That might be helping him out. But, he's definitely making moves, like you said. And this is a competitive race with three very different characters, I think.
I feel like given how early it still kind of is in the race, people still aren't getting inundated with mailers and TV ads yet, though. Trust me, mailers are coming. So what are the candidates spending all of this money on now? I'm guessing they have some general overhead expenses like staff, but are they spending or are they saving up for go time?
I feel like their burn rate is kind of high, right? They've all four candidates were spending in the million, maybe slightly more than $1 million range, which, is a solid chunk of money. So they're certainly not, being super frugal. But, they're spending on things like you said, staff, consulting. There are some digital ads out there for the Democratic candidates specifically, because Mike Rogers was on a statewide ballot, just a few months ago. But the Democratic candidates all have their pockets of where they're known, and they do need to keep expanding, their name ID statewide. And I think that is what their strategy, what their spending is going toward right now.
All right, we're going to switch gears now. And after this short break, we're going to talk about the registration fee increases for electric and hybrid vehicles that were approved as part of the road funding plan. Stick around.
Welcome back to MichMash. Joining us now is Charles Griffith, Climate and Energy Program Director with the Ecology Center. Charles, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, happy to do so.
Charles, recently the legislature passed a budget that Governor Gretchen Whitmer signed, a road funding plan that included an increase in registration fees for electric vehicles and hybrids. Tell us about those increases.
Yeah, it was kind of I think originally it was an unintentional impact of this sales tax to gas tax swap that legislators and the governor's office came up with. I didn't have necessarily a problem with that, although it did create a $1 billion gap in funding that would not still be going to where the sales tax used to go, that we had to figure out how to backfill for. But it triggered, because the EV fees that were set by the legislature back in 2015 were indexed to the gas tax. This swap triggered an increase in the EV fees that EV drivers would have to pay. Turns out it's about $100 increase. For plug-in hybrid vehicles, it's an additional $50 increase. And, we had already done a lot of work here at the Ecology Center that showed that the current, I guess it's now the previous fee structure was already resulting in EV drivers paying more than similar gas vehicles that they would pay on similar gas vehicles. So we feel like this is sort of adding, insult to injury and is not fair. And, we'd like to see this policy fixed or see this particular impact fixed.
On these increases, some are arguing that it's ensuring that hybrid and electrical vehicle drivers are paying their fair share since they don't pay as much in the gas tax. That's the argument, right? You touched on this a little bit, and I know you have some research on this. What do you make of that argument? Is this simply paying, their fair share, so to speak?
Well, no. And that's what our research has shown, and why we did the research in the first place. There was, it is true that electric vehicles don't pay gas taxes for obvious reasons. But back in 2015, when they came up with I don't know if it's really as technical as a formula, but when they came up with the basis for those EV fees, they just kind of based it on an average gasoline vehicle. And so, part of our argument early on was that, not all EVs are the same. And certainly, EVs are not an average gasoline vehicle. If you look more closely at, a similar vehicle, gas and electric, and then compare what they pay, we found that the gas vehicles are paying less than the EVs are with those fees. And now we did a study back in 2020 on this. And then more recently, there are more EV models out there, and there are enough EV models that have a gasoline equivalent. Just take, say, the F-150 Lightning, the EV versus the gasoline F-150. You can compare those head to head, and our analysis shows that the Ford F-150 Lightning driver is paying an extra $60 per year based on average mileage. So, it's just not factually true, at least based on our analysis, that EV drivers were not paying enough. In fact, our finding was that they were overpaying.
So this increase also comes as federal tax credits for hybrid and electric vehicles have ended, and automakers are sort of rethinking the strategy in their creation of hybrids and EVs. What is your feeling about the public perception toward these vehicles?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, the EV market continues to be, strong in terms of it's been growing. Some of that more recently has been spurred by the ending of those tax credits. So we had the best quarter ever in EV sales, right before the October 1st deadline for getting those tax incentives. And, all expectations are it's going to taper off a little bit, but some of the manufacturers are continuing to offer incentives similar to what the federal tax credit was. So, maybe it won't drop off as much as, folks thought it might. And, the other thing that was happening is that, the regulations for vehicles, standards have also been weakened by the new administration. And so that's providing less of a driver for manufacturers to produce some of these vehicles. And so there's some adjustments being made. But in general, I think all the major manufacturers are continuing to roll out new and more EV models, just maybe at a little slower pace. And so I think the future looks good, but it's in a little bit of a bumpy period. We certainly don't want to add more insult to injury by dinging them with unfair state taxes, which, by the way, don't really add much revenue to the state budget because there's not that many EVs on the road. It's like less than $9 million additional revenue that will come from this, pretty onerous additional fee.
Yeah, I think, we're talking about $9 million and an almost $2 billion road plan. It's, not a huge amount of money. When we talk about road funding, there is also this discussion that because not even just EVs and hybrids, but vehicles in general are using less fuel, are more efficient. So the gas tax, potentially is not the best long-term plan, to be the main source of revenue. And you discussed this in your research, I believe, as well. Are hybrid and EVs the main reason that vehicles are more efficient?
Well, actually, no, again. I mean, they are obviously more efficient, uh, but they constitute still a pretty small percentage of vehicles sold and also on the road in general. What we found is actually just basic gasoline vehicles have gotten a lot more efficient over time. And that because there's so many more of them on the road, that increased in efficiency is actually leading to the biggest potential reductions in revenue. And if the state really wanted to solve this, the potential impacts from more efficient vehicles, they should look there. Unfortunately, increasing the gas tax was not really on the table. Increasing registration fees or some other measure like that was not really on the table. By the way, registration fees have been a bigger source of revenue for road funding than gas tax in recent years. I think that will shift now that we've moved the sales tax into a gas tax, so that will probably raise more revenues now. But the state's also very interested in exploring this idea of a road user charge that they did get money in the budget to do a pilot project for. And we have mixed views about that kind of approach because, again, more efficient vehicles would end up paying more under most designs for how these road user charges would work. And the bigger and more less efficient vehicles would get sort of a break. And we think there should be some way to adjust for the relative efficiency of the vehicle or size of the vehicle when setting what those road user charges would be if we go to a model like that.
The road funding plan does include more funding for transit, which the Ecology Center advocated for. What ended up in the final product?
Yeah, this was actually a really good surprise. So at least there is was some good news in the transportation budget. We're part of a coalition that fought really hard to get an increase in funding for transit. It's another form of transportation infrastructure that has been underfunded. So our point of view was, if we're going to come up with new revenues for roads, and historically there's been a percentage of that carved out for transit and other forms of transportation like rail or maybe even walking and biking paths and things like that, that should get its full share of increase too. And we were worried that wasn't going to happen. But the final road funding package ended up with about almost $100 million in additional dollars for transit operations. And so that will allow transit agencies to, try to make up for kind of lost ground in recent years. And then there was another $65 million in kind of innovative transportation projects or transit projects. So there's some money to support, some new ideas that transit agencies might want to try out, and that would help provide some of the capital resources that they might need. This is probably the biggest increase for transit agencies in decades. So this was a big victory, I have to say.
One of the things we often hear from officials and residents is, the lack of transit in the state makes it harder to attract or keep young people here and is a factor, as the state is trying to bring in new businesses, trying to boost population. You always hear transit around those conversations. Do you think the investments made in this budget, do you think that can make a dent in efforts to sort of overhaul and improve public transit in the state?
I'll go with the words you just used. It can make a dent.
Mhm.
And it was an important dent because, we've been going backwards, like as I was suggesting a minute ago. And so directionally, this is important. I think we, will need to continue looking at other models going forward. We were also big supporters of the regional transit authority creation many years ago for the 4 counties in Southeast Michigan. And, there was a whole plan that unfortunately failed to get funding back in 2017, I believe it was. And they've been a little shy in coming back to the voters to ask for an increase, in part due to some lack of support in certain parts of that 4 county area. So we do need to still explore other revenue, I think, if we're going to really get a vibrant, regional transportation system. But, honestly, we need it all over the state. It's not just urban areas, it's rural areas that are suffering from people who can't afford automobiles and can't get around to medical appointments or even the grocery store and things like that. So I think transit is generally good. We just have to figure out how to pay for it and how to make it, very efficient and convenient for people to use.
Charles, thank you so much for joining us here today on MichMash.
Hey, it was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.